Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Congressman. Good to see you again.
It's great to see you, Ron.
Before we get into the nitty-gritty of some of the policy choices, let me ask get some of your thoughts on the big picture of what we're seeing. The National Center for Education Statistics, tells us that the percentage of kids in any form of organized childcare outside of the home the year before kindergarten really hasn't changed much in the last 20 years. It was 55% in 1995 and 58% in 2012, which is the most recent year we have complete data. As a general matter of public policy, do we want that number going up? Should it be the goal of public policy to encourage more 3- and 4-year-old children to be taught outside the home?
That's a great question, and I believe that it is. I believe that we want kids, especially at the ages of 3 and 4, to be in learning environments. And so it is troubling that the number has stagnated over the years. And Margaret mentioned that over the last several years, state and local governments have taken an even greater role in offering pre-K programs. In my hometown of San Antonio, when my brother Julian was mayor in 2012, the city, of course, adopted a 1/8 cent sales tax to expand pre-K to many students across the city. But yes, because we want them to be learning and starting off with a strong foundation.
One other thing we know is that there are substantial disparities in access to childcare based on income, parental education, and to a lesser extent race. The data, again, from NCAS is on the chart, should be on the chart behind me. Or, there we go. Yes. If you look at parents' educational attainment, it says that 72% of kids whose parents are high school graduates were in any kind of child care the year before kindergarten, and 46% were in center-based care. Those numbers rise significantly for kids whose parents have college or postgraduate degrees. Similarly, when you look at income, there we go. When you look at income, you see a big increase, a steady increase as you move up the socioeconomic ladder in access to both any kind of child care outside the home, but in particular center-based care, the kind that we're talking about. A little less clear on race, but on education and income, a very clear pattern. What explains those disparities? Is it just simply funds, resources, or are there other factors involved as well?
That is a big part of it. I imagine some of it is availability of those centers, particularly in rural areas, for example, where you may not have the same kind of infrastructure. But a lot of it is basically a matter of income. So you have a lot of low-income Americans and even lower middle-class Americans who simply can't spend in Texas, for example, $600 or $700 or $800 or more to send a child to a learning center, for example. And so I think that's where you see the disparity, whereas folks with a higher degree of education more often do.
Now, you mentioned in San Antonio you've created your own program. Let's talk a little bit about, first, who has had access to that? Who are you reaching with that? And then second, let's talk a little bit about the challenge of maintaining quality, which is a whole big part of this debate as you expand. But let's start with who's benefiting, as best you can tell. Who's accessing the program?
Mostly it was underprivileged kids. It was kids that are in the lower socioeconomic brackets. But also there were basically seats carved out for military families, for example. And then there was also essentially a lottery portion where folks could also, regardless of their income, have their kids placed in pre-K for SA. There are 4 centers across the city. So the city tried to design the program so that it served all areas of the city. And it's only been a few years, but it's been incredibly successful so far.
Now, one thing we know about preschool education is that quality counts a lot. I mean, there have been experts in the field who have been disappointed in some studies that have shown the results for kids in early childhood education dissipate by the 3rd grade. But there was a terrific recent pretty comprehensive review of the literature recently by Brookings, which made the case that those studies really show the need for high-quality programs, which have produced better results. And they wrote, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, New Jersey, and Boston, which we'll be hearing more about later, pre-kindergarten programs demonstrate impressive outcomes that include positive effects on math scores, grade retention, and chronic absenteeism at the end of grade 8, increased achievement on language, arts, literacy, math, and science, as well as decreased grade retention and special education placement at the end of grade 5. As you have gone from 0 to 4 centers and about 2,400 kids, you said now?
Yeah, it's a few thousand.
What have you learned about what it takes to maintain quality as you are ramping up?
Well, a few things. First, when this program was hatched, it was an effort between advocates, parents, the business community. Everybody basically came together and said, how can we design the best program for San Antonio? And so in terms of the quality, one of the linchpins of that was making sure that you had the very best teachers that we could find to teach these classes. And I think that that has made a difference. With respect to the folks who criticize the lasting effects of pre-K education, I think there's two things to note. The first thing is the quality does matter. So it depends on what kind of teaching and what kind of instruction the students are getting. But the second part is, if the argument is that by third or fourth or fifth grade, some of that effect has ebbed, I think that you need to look at what's going on in those years in elementary school, and that it speaks more to that period than it does to whether you should or should not start off
That is one of the things I
strong.
want to ask you about. I mean, it was how difficult is it to ensure that in the handoff to the public schools, the gains aren't lost? Now, what is the relationship like between this program and the public school system?
Pretty well integrated, but you're right. I mean, it can be tough. I liken it to the situation that happens between high schools and colleges, right? Where sometimes you can have this back and forth when a high school student places in developmental or remedial math or English when they get to college. There's this debate between the college and the high schools about who's responsible for that. So there's a little bit of that going on too, but I don't think that challenge is enough to say that we shouldn't try and we shouldn't do and expand pre-K.
How, another challenge in this area has been retention of teachers. You know, a lot of turnover, a lot of turning, largely due to the wages and in some cases the conditions, but often, you know, what you can pay. What are you learning there in San Antonio about what it takes? Is it just simply the pay scale?
A lot of it is recruiting the best folks and paying them well. It really does mean that you're going to have more applicants and more people interested. I remember when pre-K for SA came on board and it was announced, and the salaries were very good salaries compared to the other districts around in San Antonio. They were flooded with applications from teachers who wanted to teach there, and not only teachers from San Antonio, but also from throughout Texas and throughout the nation. So it does make a big difference.
How much further, well, through your own resources in San Antonio, how far do you think you've been able to reach in terms of the kids that you need to reach?
The reach has been significant, but honestly, there's more work to do. It doesn't cover all income levels, for example, so it's not like it's open for everybody, essentially, because there are a lot of parents that would like to have their kids in the program who simply are not part of it. So we still have work to do. That said, San Antonio has the largest pre-K offering of any city in Texas. So we are further along, I think, than any other Texas city, but we still got a ways to go.
Some people would argue, they say, look, Boston, New York, San Antonio, Seattle, Denver, Chicago, the places that want to do this are doing this. And so let's just let them do it. We don't really need a statewide program. We don't need much less a national program. The places that want to do this are finding the resources to do it. What's wrong with that argument?
Well, two things. First, in the legislation that I filed last term and will refile this term, I actually adopt a local model where we would essentially cut out the middlemen of states and allow local entities to apply directly for federal monies so that they essentially could fund their own programs. And part of the reason that I say that is because if you don't do that, what you get into is oftentimes states rejecting monies, which means that every local entity in the state is essentially denied monies for whether it's education or highways or Medicaid expansion. I say let the local entities apply directly. So I don't necessarily think that's a bad model as long as some larger government, right, a state government or a federal government is going to make those monies available. If you have the federal government that retrenches or a state government that pulls back, like Texas did in 2011, in 2011, the Texas state government cut $5.4 billion out of public education, including at least a few $100 million out of pre-K. Only part of that money has come back since then. So when that happens, then whether you're trying to do it through the state or the local entities, it becomes difficult.
Talk a little about your legislation, because maybe go back a step. You talked about how there'd be federal money available for cities, but go back a step and explain the broader concept. Is it your view that why in your view does there need to be a federal program to support the expansion, and how far should that expansion go? Is the goal that every child the year before kindergarten? What are you seeking to achieve?
I think that it should be available to every child. Some parents are going to make the decision to when a child is 3 years old, to keep them at home or have them with relatives. But I think that pre-K opportunity should be available to everyone. In terms of the federal role, I do think the federal government has a helpful role to play in making resources available. For example, in ESSA, as y'all probably know, there was about $250 million for pre-K education. Now, a lot of that, of course, is going through the states, so you're relying on the state governments to essentially have their act together on pre-K programs, right? And that's where, in terms of my legislation, I quibble because I come from Texas, and I have real critiques with how the state government has done not only pre-kindergarten education, but also public education in general.
And in fact, when you look at the data on states, there is enormous variation. 2014, I believe, is the most recent year available. 84% of 4-year-olds in Vermont are enrolled in a public pre-K program. 77% in Florida, 60% or more in Oklahoma, West Virginia, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Iowa. By the way, you can see that there's not a clear red state, blue state pattern there. Meanwhile, in 12 other states, the percentage of 4-year-olds in public programs are in single digits. And in 8 states, there are no programs at all, no public programs at all. So is there a case? I mean, are we now saying, are you in essence saying that the same way that we'd say that, from K through 12, everyone should have access? Is pre-K now part of that continuum?
That's certainly the case that I'm making. And you make a great point, Ron, which is that this is really not a Republican or a Democratic or conservative or liberal issue. States like Oklahoma, where one of my co-chairs, Tom Cole, is from, Republican, have done a good job with pre-K education. And as you mentioned, other places have as well. So, we have over 30 members in the pre-K caucus. I'm one of the co-chairs of the pre-K caucus in the House of Representatives. And, so we always try to avoid partisan politics and make the point that pre-K education really is for everyone, whether you're in a red state or a blue state.
We're going to hear from Alabama later, which is not a state normally at the forefront of kind of social, spending innovations, that is investing significantly in this area. Early childhood is an area where the new president put down some markers, unlike a lot of domestic issues where he was, relatively vague. The proposal he discussed during the campaign was centered on tax deductions and changes. He allows families up to $500,000 to deduct the average cost of child care from their taxes and would provide a refundable credit through the EITC for lower income families. Is this what do you make of that? Is that an economically efficient way of expanding access to child care?
The deductions by themselves, if you offer a credit, I do think that it would cover many more Americans. If it's just a tax deduction, that's more problematic because it would leave out probably 40% of people. But, look, I'm open to see what he proposes. You think about it, this has been obviously an extraordinary 6 weeks in this presidency. But as we were talking earlier, all of the things that have happened so far, the executive orders that the president has signed, I think the health care bill is the first bill where the president and the Congress are actually both involved in some kind of substantive policy. So I'm anxious to see what he puts out there.
Parenthetically, do you have a prediction on that? Is that
will
they get that through?
It's going to be tough. Yeah, it's going to be obviously very tough from them, both from Democrats, but also from the Freedom Caucus on the right. The Heritage Foundation I saw came out against it. So it's going to be an uphill battle for him.
The other element, I'm back to our regularly scheduled programming. The other element of
we can talk about Russia if you want
to.
I'm on the Intelligence Committee, so this is a good break from talking about Russia.
They may have universal pre-K. I'm not sure. The president also proposed, similarly, continuing with the tax focus, the president also proposed tax-favored dependent care savings accounts that would go further than current law, giving people both tax-free accumulation and allowing individuals to establish them and provide matches for low-income parents. In that these are more like kind of demand side. You're providing more buying power to families to go out.
Right.
And I guess my question would be, in lower income communities, in places in San Antonio, is it, even with more money, if families have more money, is there the supply of quality childcare for them to access, or do you need, in essence, to address both sides of the equation?
I think you have to incentivize high quality instruction, and whether it's the state government or the federal government doing that, or the local government doing it in some instances, that's very important because you don't want to just be sending kids anywhere, basically, right?
And that's why I wonder, if you just give parents money and that's all you do,
Yeah.
I mean, the assumption, I guess, is that quality programs will emerge to serve the buying power that you're creating. Do you think that's right? Or do you in fact think this could be seen as complementary to ideas like your own, which really are about creating more, creating the institutions?
Again, I'm interested to see what exactly he comes up with. It could be, but I don't think that something like that is just going to magically happen, right? There's got to be standards put in place to make sure that it does happen. And also, I think it could possibly work if it's an add-on to what exists now. For example, when the president put out his blueprint, not his line item budget, but his blueprint for a budget, his big intention is to beef up the military or make sure that we have a bigger military. But he's also talking about making sometimes severe cuts in domestic spending on other things. So if you're going to institute these new policies and incentives, but at the same time start to cut into other pre-K things or Head Start or other programs, then you're really at best taking one step forward and one step back.
And that kind of leads into the other piece on the board is the Better Way document that House Republicans put out last year, which may be the most detailed explication of Republican thinking right now on early childhood. The main idea in there was consolidation of programs. They wrote, "Our commitment to early childhood development must not be measured by the number of programs created or the amount of money spent, but rather the results. Congress needs to be responsive to taxpayers by eliminating wasteful, duplicative, and ineffective programs. Funds should be streamlined into one simplified approach out of the 45 duplicative, they say there are 45 duplicative or overlapping early childhood federal programs, and they should be consolidated into one funding stream to provide greater funding flexibility and resource decision-making to state and local communities." Is there a case for consolidation?
I think a review of the efficacy of our programs is appropriate. Now, I believe that many of these programs have been very effective for some of them for over a generation now. But that preamble language can't just be a reason to start cutting everything, right? Or a reason to just target programs and go after them and eliminate them. But sure, certainly reviewing them for their efficacy, I think, is fair.
How many Republicans in your pre-K caucus?
We have probably, I would say, maybe 7 or 8.
And from them, do you get any sense of have they given you any feel for what this means to them? Do they in fact have a vision of how you would streamline or revise what already exists?
My sense at least from the folks that are part of the caucus is that, first of all, they appreciate the effect of pre-K and its usefulness for students. They're not determined to just go out there and cut pre-K programs or other programs in early childhood learning. And so, I don't think that the folks that are part of the caucus are just dead set on cutting everything. I think they want to take a fair look. Now, we've got obviously 435 people in the House of Representatives, and so, you've got a lot of opinions out there, but there are a good group of Republicans, I think, who are set on protecting pre-K.
I want to bring in a couple other areas. We're talking mostly about the year before kindergarten now, but public programs there's even less access for younger children, for 3-year-old children. There was a Center for American Progress report from 2015. A national survey of child care centers found that among programs that are free to all parents, less than 9% serve children under age 1, 44% do not serve children under age 3 at all. And only in 6 states do even 10% of 3-year-olds attend any kind of preschool. In San Antonio, how do you deal with the question of 3-year-olds, and what do you think about that?
Well,
is that a bridge too far?
No, actually, we have basically a pretty extensive 3-year-old program, not only in pre-K for SA, but also in our school districts. And so now with the school districts, most of that is also based on income, for example, or English language learners. So you're serving basically an underprivileged population, which means that you do have some folks who are going to have to go pay for it privately themselves, who are not going to qualify for having their children in the school district programs. But that has continued to grow in Texas over the years. Those programs, the 3-year-old programs, which is a good thing.
Do you find a difference in the cultural reaction to the idea of a 3-year-old as opposed to a 4 or 5-year-old being taken outside the home? Is there more resistance, or is it pretty much the same?
I mean, quite honestly, and also when I practiced law, for a few years I did family law. right? And so oftentimes when families were going through these custody arrangements or battles, the question would come up about what to do with a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old. And there would be this debate sometimes among the parents or between the parents about whether they should be placed in an early education center or learning center pre-K program, or whether they should stay with a relative like a grandmother or somebody else. So, ultimately that choice is going to be made by the parents, but I do think that we can incentivize and encourage them to place their kids in pre-K.
I want to go back to this chart that we looked at. It shows this rather striking disparity of access based on parental education, and it kind of goes to this overriding debate and anxiety we've had in the country about whether whether the American dream is still possible, whether it's still possible for kids. If the operational definition of the American dream is that every generation will live better than their parents, whether that is still achievable for kids. Because here you see kind of the perverse results that those who start with the most are most likely to receive the added boost of early childhood, and we could look at measures all the way through education that would be similar. What is the case? What is the argument for if you were talking to the parents who are on the right side of this divide, who have the funds and kind of the time and the resources to send their kids to preschool? What is the case you could make to them about why it is in their interest to invest in the kids on the other side of that divide?
Well, because all of those kids are going to be the future workers in this country. They're the folks that are going to help power the economy in the states and across the nation. So if we have a generation of kids who are poorly educated, then the entire nation suffers. Everybody suffers. And the investment relative to the outcome and to the benefit later on is relatively small. And so it is in everybody's interest to invest in pre-K programs, to strengthen those pre-K programs. But also, Ron, I think fundamentally, most people, and most especially parents, whether they're your kids or not, I think most people want to do right by kids, regardless of their political ideology.
We have another version of this, though, at the federal level in the budget blueprint or priorities that the president put out, where he said, I'm going to increase defense spending.
Right.
I am going to exempt Social Security and Medicare, which benefits the senior population, which parenthetically is 80% white at this point, and which voted for him 3-2. But we're going to focus all of the cuts on discretionary programs, which essentially are all the investments in the productivity of the next generation, whether it's education, preschool, scientific research, all of those kinds of things aimed at the next generation. And you could look at that and say, okay, I'm basically sheltering my coalition and focusing the knife on the other guy's coalition. Is there a case that can be made to those older right of center leaning voters that they have a stake in these kids on the wrong side of that divide?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think some of them are their grandkids,
But in many cases they're not. That's the problem, right?
Yeah,
Which is that that we are now at a point where a majority of the public school students in the U.S. are kids of color.
Yeah.
And 3/4 of Americans over 45 are white. I mean, there is a giant racial generation gap that is brewing in all of these resource allocation issues. So is there a case, even if it's not their grandkids, is there a case you can make to them?
Sure, absolutely. Again, these kids are the folks who later on are going to be the workers that are responsible for upholding this economy, which is still the most powerful economy in the world. But if you lose a generation of people, or if you continue to lose generations, then that's not going to be the case. I think we can't take our position in the world for granted and our economy for granted. So people are also living longer. So if you have somebody who's 60 years old now and thinks, well, as I've heard before, taxpayers, remember in Texas and in other states, a big chunk of how we pay for education comes from property taxes and homeowners. And so there's a lot of people
local version of this national argument.
They make the argument, Ron, basically, hey, I don't have kids in public school, or I send my kids to private school. Why should I be paying the taxes for our schools?
Among other things, those kids today are the adults who are going to be paying the payroll taxes to support Social Security
That's absolutely
and
right.
Medicare for
a generation that is a generation that is living longer. So again, if somebody's 60 years old, they could expect to be around now, I think until about 82 or 83, 84. And so So it's going to matter for them that these kids are able to be productive people and power the economy.
Let me ask you about one last area real quick, and I think we're going to, do we have questions? Yeah, I'll bring in the audience in one moment. But real quick, there have been efforts that, you know, beyond the center-based care. The Affordable Care Act, I think, had a big funding, and there have been other programs at different levels about really bringing people into the home, about helping parents, you know, equipping parents to help their kids. Where do you see that within the overall framework of early childhood?
Having parents...
programs to help parents, you know, programs aimed at parents themselves, rather than just instruction for the kids, instruction for the, either coaching, counseling, guidance.
Well, in San Antonio and in Texas, one of the most successful programs over the years was called Avance, which worked with mothers of young children, and basically, especially low-income mothers and families, helping them with parenting skills and helping them teach their kids, you know, in those very formative years. So I think that's absolutely critical. You're right, and those things happen obviously before they're handed off to an institution like a learning center or school. And I say that knowing how important it is now, because my wife and I have a 3-year-old daughter and a 1-year-old son. So, you know, everybody that's lived through those years as a parent knows how important...
Sleep deprived they are.
Oh, yes. They're rough, but I mean, to the kids, I mean, that really is the foundation, basically.
Yeah. All right, let's bring in the audience. Do we have questions? We have Mike. We have a question up here. All in the front.
Right.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Sullivan. I'm from Madison Services Group. I'm a former pre-K teacher on the south side of Chicago in daycare settings. And one of the biggest issues I had was constantly being pulled out of the classroom in order to meet all the federal and state and local funding requirements, all of the paperwork. How do we address that so that teachers like myself can get back to teaching?
That's a great question. And we've heard obviously similar issues with teachers in public education, in high schools, for example. But it is something that we have to take a look at. Teachers at whatever level they're teaching should be able to do their primary job, just like counselors in schools should be able to do their primary job. So it is something that Congress should take a deeper look at.
Congressman Castro, final question. What would look like success? I mean, are we ever, is the goal to get to a point where 100% of kids are in some kind of center-based care the year before kindergarten, or is there always going to be kind of a limit to how many people are willing to do that? What does success look like for you in terms of expanding access?
I think for me at least, as many people as possible who want to have their kids in pre-kindergarten education are able to do that. I think unless you mandate it, right, you're always going to have a slice of folks who, for whatever reason, they want their kids at home with them or they want them with relatives. But as many people as possible who want to have their kids in that learning environment are able to do that.
Representative Castro, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.